dear colleagues. Is this working?
Yes, Silke.
Yes, it is.
We can hear you. We can hear you. Thank you.
Very good.
We can hear you well.
So we've been waiting just a little bit because maybe all of you from around the world that there are waiting rooms now to get into our sessions online. And so we apologize for those who will come in a few minutes, but I can reassure all that they will not miss out on the great presentations from our speakers. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this very special session of the E4J dialogue series. This is a session that is co-organized by the International Association of Universities and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. Very pleased to also welcome speakers from around the world, and we hope for a lively debate and discussion towards the end of the session. So the title of this session is one that is appealing to many. We could see in the social media and overall communication that many actually reacted to it. It is to reaching the SDG16 through higher education, and thus combining two SDGs that are essential for the future of the higher education sector. SDG16, building peace in the minds of people, and SDG4, creating the grounds upon which to build quality higher education. So let's discuss how this will work. I would like to start by inviting, but I can't really use the screen, can I? Like this. So I would like to invite all to turn off their cameras. Participants are muted by default, but some can activate their cameras, but it's a bit distracting. So if you please do always think about turning off your cameras and use the chat for questions and comments. That will be very useful, not only for the discussion at the end of the session, but as well, we then take up the questions and comments for later work in the field of SDG 14 and linking up to SDG 16, and linking up to SDG 4. As well, use the toolbar to adjust your settings, and if you have questions, you can ask those as well in the chat box. So very much welcome. I'm the Secretary General of the International Association of Universities, and for those who do not know, a very quick introduction to inform you a little bit of the point of view from where I sit and why we have decided now for a few years already to partner with UNODC to work on the very important topic of SDG 16, and in particular to support the work in the context of E4J and the dialogue series that we are in today. So the IAU was created in 1950 under the auspices of UNESCO. It was really called into life by both the delegations to UNESCO and institutions from around the world, both universities and other higher education institutions, to together build a better world for the many. It's an independent international non-governmental organization, and since 1950 we've always been based at UNESCO and now in the building still in Paris, France. So we speak out of the buildings in a sense, but we are really insisting on this independent voice dimension of our work, since that allows us to actually exchange, discuss and debate with governments on how to support higher education better for the future. The membership is from all over the world. We have 600 member institutions, 30 member organizations. We also count affiliates, those other higher education stakeholders that do work on higher education yet do not have member institutions, for instance. And we also bring together associates, which are experts from around the world working on the different dimensions of the development of higher education. The strategic priorities are fourfold. We work on internationalization, value-based leadership. We work on the digital transformation of higher education, and in particular on higher education and research for sustainable development. Why do I say in particular? It is because it is obviously more linked to the debates that we are having here today. The IAU work is manifold. We work with surveys and reports that are to inform the leading discussions, but also to inform policy decisions for the future role of higher education, and also are to help create the grounds upon which to include and involve higher education even better in many work that is being carried out to rebuild our societies, and maybe especially so today in the context of the pandemic. So we know you all face many different challenges. We just hope that higher education will be high on the radar of the many in order for the institutions and the systems themselves to help rebuild the societies in order to create the kind of societies that we want for the future. So what have we done as to generate new grounds and also help transform the sector, but to help address the challenges at the global level? We have created an IAU Global Cluster on Higher Education and Research for Sustainable Development and invited universities from around the world to take the lead on all the different SDGs. Not to silo them out. The colors have very nice squares around them. And you may think, well, this is to actually work specifically only on SDG16 or SDG4. Yet we all know that the SDGs are entirely interconnected, and that on the contrary, interdisciplinary approaches to sustainable development are essential. Connecting the dots between all the different parts that are taken up as definition of the global challenges are essential. Because without peace, we don't have any grounds upon which to build better grounds for better health, for better gender equality, for better possibilities to address the issues of poverty or hunger, and to address climate change, to name just but a few. So the SDG16 is being led by the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and SDG4 is being led by the University of York in Canada. And the two are working very hard in their own dimensions, but they are also here today very closely linked. So welcome to the debate that we have, and welcome to looking at how we can actually maximize on the opportunities that are out there. The UNODC, as you will hear, is an organization that is essential to fostering the development of education grounds for SDG16. The E4J initiative is one with unique dimensions that people can pick up in many education forms at all the levels of the higher education landscape. And thus, we really are very pleased and honored to work together hand in hand to advance SDG16 in the best possible way, because we know that education is a very powerful tool and probably the most powerful tool to change our societies for the better. So without further ado, I would like to really also introduce you to the speakers. They have lots to contribute, and they will address this very difficult question that we have on the screen. To reach SDG 16 through education at large, and in particular through higher education, we need to see if we are actually doing the right thing and are prepared enough and ready to educate the future leaders as we should. You will see that the speakers come with many different backgrounds. They are really from different backgrounds, not only geographic, also from where they speak. So we have speakers from Nairobi, Kenya, from James Madison University in the USA, from Qatar, from Vienna, and as well from the ministry backgrounds, from university backgrounds, from the UN organizations background. So I believe that we really have good grounds here to advance on the issues that are in front of us. We try to have a nice gender balance, and I think we succeeded there as well, which is one important SDG as well. We need to all be part of the conversations in the best possible way. We have so much to contribute. So I hope that all the speakers are now in the room, and I'm not too sure that I already saw Dr. Terry Betzel, Professor of Justice Studies and Director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Global Nonviolence at James Madison University. He had some difficulty in accessing the platform, and I would like to ask maybe Bianca if you have seen Dr. Betzel come in the room.
Hello, Hilje. No,
Yes.
unfortunately, Dr. Basil is not yet with us. He has informed us that he has technical problems joining right now. We work on that and hope we'll have him maybe as a speaker before I start my presentation, if that's okay.
Yes, that is perfectly fine. We will then move on to listening to Dr. Kariuki Muiga, environmental consultant and law scholar at the University of Nairobi. We're very pleased to have you with us because you teach in the law faculty, but also at other institutions, and you're also currently chair of the private law department. And I think you have a lot to contribute as wearing the different hats you have. We had the chance to have a pre-discussion prior to the session here. And I just hope that the few minutes that are at your disposal will allow you to share some of the wealth of information that you could contribute to the debate later. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Kariuki Muiga.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good night, depending on the time zone you are in. My name is Kariuki Muigwa, Dr. Kariuki Muigwa from the University of Nairobi. I can see in the audience we have our Dr. Denya, who I work with from the Wangari Maathai Institute. Within the University of Nairobi, I teach in the School of Law, and I also teach in the Wangari Maathai Institute. I teach environmental law, I teach international commercial arbitration, and I interact with students relating to peace and conflict studies. I had a presentation. I wish you could run it for me. But I'll go on as you try to run it for me. Essentially, what we are looking at this afternoon is the mutual reinforcement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're looking at goal number 4 relating to higher education, and goal number 16, which is about peace, a few other things, and access to justice. And I will look at it from the Kenyan context very, very briefly within the time I have. Higher education in Kenya is available to a large group of people. Of course, there are those who are not able to access it, but it is available. And the way we approach it, and when I say we, I'm talking about the teachers, the students, and other stakeholders within the Kenyan context, is we look at education as a tool for empowerment. And it is in a sense, we are looking at the present generation getting empowered to be able to influence policy change, engage in peace and conflict management, but also we look at the current generation educating the future generations. So essentially, we are ready, we think, to educate future leaders. We are not perfect. There are many challenges, but we are doing it. One of the unique things we do in this country, Kenya, is to blend the formal and informal education, so that we have the formal education, the international principles relating to environment, peace, justice, and so on, but we try to blend that with the informal legal education. We try to see what is the understanding by the common person relating to the same concepts. We also have multidisciplinary approaches. For example, within Wangari Maathai, you would find that we teach environmental science. We have peace and conflict studies. Within the Center for Advanced Studies in Environmental Law and Policy, we teach environmental law, environmental diplomacy, and environmental policy. So we are really multidisciplinary, and it's an approach that we find does work for us. When we think about education, we ask ourselves, how can we relate education to technology? How do we relate education to innovation? So that the end goal would be advancement in technology, advancement in innovation. We also use, within the institutions I have described for you, education for environmental governance in all its respects. Peace and security is something we are very, very conscious of, cognizant of Article 33 of the UN Charter, which is to the effect that if there's a conflict, it should be dealt with through mediation, negotiation, conciliation, and other mechanisms. Within the Kenyan context, we have Article 159 of the Constitution, which then reflects the mechanisms, but adds one significant mechanism, the traditional justice systems. Just move the slides for me up to slide number 4. That's where I am. So within the Kenyan Constitution, then we are enforcing the fact that, yes, we are within a global environment, but there is a traditional justice systems that have existed for ages within our context, and we harness those without ignoring them, subject, of course, to upholding human rights. So that whatever systems are there, then they should respect human rights. So we are trying to get a synergy between SDG 4 and 16. The education we envisage is meaningful education that can enable parties to access justice. Indeed, we are in a unique country where access to justice is legislated in our Constitution, the supreme law of the land, Article 48 and 50 of the Constitution, so that we are, through education, ensuring access to justice, but also very importantly, access to information, which is also a constitutional imperative that is guaranteed. We are also using education within the institutions that I teach in to try and achieve a clean and healthy environment as envisaged in our Constitution. This is my slide number 5. But we also make use of advocacy to ensure that the state carries out its obligations, because the Kenyan state has certain obligations, including peace building, peacemaking, taking care of the environment, monitoring the environment, and so on. And these are examples that I'm giving relating to the courses that we teach in Wangari Maathai Institute and the University of Nairobi, which are oriented towards these goals. So we are looking at formal education blended with the informal. We are looking at multidisciplinary approaches, very practical approaches involving fieldwork, internships, and harnessing of traditional knowledge. So that our students will go out there, interact with people, and find out what is it they are doing. Traditional knowledge, what is it? So that we have linkages with the people on the ground. We ensure public participation and what is called environmental democracy, the idea that decisions should be made by those who are affected by them, and subsidiarity, the idea that decisions should be made at the lowest level by those who are affected. We also look at education to deal with vices such as corruption, drugs, and crime. And we do collaborate with the students, fellow teachers, and other institutions to fight those vices using education, involving teachers, students, parents, and ensuring stakeholder participation to achieve that result, which is essentially SDG number 16. In the course of our teaching, we have private and public partnerships. There is involvement in government. And I have experience in that. I sit in the Environment Tribunal, so I'm able to see it from that perspective. Kenya is a member of the UN. Certainly, we are working together in that one, and the private sector. So essentially, what we are doing in Kenya is moving forward with education, ensuring that we can use education for the purposes I've described. And we are saying, in conclusion, that higher education empowers and unlocks massive potential for the present and future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muigwa. And we will have time to discuss the different points that you made. I really see many points that could be applied to many other disciplines as well. The importance of multidisciplinary approaches the importance of harnessing traditional knowledge, and thus to also connect the local with the global. You used the term meaningful education, and that is a very powerful one, because it forces many to, when using that term, it forces many to indeed look at what education actually means, for what for whom, and through what means. There is another very important point, obviously, that you make, and that is the connect of the human rights agenda, which is maybe coming with some translation, as you said, in local context, but also very closely relates to the global environment. And thus, those points are part and parcel of many of the initiatives that are taken up in higher education, more broadly speaking. So we have to get back to those and discuss them at the end. Thank you for this very powerful presentation. I see that Dr. Terry Betzel has joined us, and you're also already full on the screen. I believe we will then invite you to take the floor and address the audience on the many important points you would wish to make. The connect with the previous speaker is a rather easy one, because you're a professor of justice studies and the director of the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Global Nonviolence at James Madison University. And so you also have the law agenda and the legal part that is at the heart of many of the debates in SDG16 in your portfolio, if I may use that terminology. So if you would agree, without further ado, I would give the floor to you, Terry, and I invite you to also use the time allocated of 8 minutes to your presentation.
And so I think we can work in the school not as an isolated bubble, but in the wide reality, and this will be much.
Terry, does this work?
Can you see me?
I can see you, and I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
My apologies. I restarted my computer and everything seemed to work. So my apologies that I missed a few points this morning and being here on time. So I am going to speak more broadly about what is the point of higher education and why bother. And so higher education provides methods for discerning the limits of truth claims and literature reviews to assess the state of knowledge. One thing I discovered about myself is that I was convinced that each social and political theory I was reading at the time was the correct one, until I would read the next one, and then that would be the correct one. So my starting point here is that I have limited knowledge and I might be wrong. If we are wrong, then what? And here is the importance of the literature review, what others already know. So I found that people have already answered questions that I did not even think about asking. And for example, the United Nations probably has an office already dedicated to the specific issues that you may be interested in. So I'm going to move very briefly to an exercise for how we can tell the different stories with the same facts. And this often happens when we get into conflict scenarios and we listen to different stories. When we get into transitional justice, everyone has their own story. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. And this is a story that happened in the United States where a child is bitten by rats while lying in the crib. I won't go into details of the accounts, but 3 different headlines appeared the same day in different newspaper. So version 1 simply says, rats bite infant. The first version of the story finds relevance in the fact that the child's mother is a teenager on welfare. As with much reporting about poverty, the story implies that ignorance and lack of personal responsibility are at the root of urban problems. Version 2 the headline reads, "Rats Bite Infant, Landlord Tenants Dispute Blame." The second version of the story is another typical way of discussing poverty as a kind of dispute between parties. The implication of such stories is that if we had better landlords or more responsible tenants, then horrible things like children getting bitten by rats would not happen. Stories like this often lead to calls for more effective communication between the parties. Now, it's version 3 that I want to concentrate a little bit more on. And that's that the headline reads, "Rat bites rising in cities, zones of death." So the third version of the story frames the rat bites as a symptom of a broader public health crisis facing a poor community. So this story assumes a relationship between public policy choices and larger group human behavior. Unlike the first two versions, version 3 implies that the reader must share some responsibility for this state of affairs. After all, anti-poverty and public health programs would not be cut if the people would put pressure on politicians to fund them. So which story is correct? All stories hold certain truths, but I believe here we need to devote more energy to the third version of the account above and consider these social problems and the social systems in which social problems exist. So next, I'm going to move fairly quickly here. Next, we are all familiar with basic human rights, and these are incredibly important. I want to direct attention to basic human responsibilities. Might we have basic human responsibilities to each other? Looking back through ancient thought, we have some basic guidelines that come down through the ages. One answer that kept appearing in all of the world's religions that have existed for thousands of years, well, some, yes. So is this phrase that kept in some variation kept appearing, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." So I think this really leads us to, it's not, focus on your human rights and argue those in front of others. It's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So this brings us then to a larger question, I believe, and that is, who is responsible to do what for whom? For example, if we live in a democracy, we are to some extent responsible for the actions of our government. If we are aware of injustice, we are to some extent responsible for what happens if we know and we choose not to act. And I can go on and on. I have about 18 of these different kinds of possible responsibilities that we have. But I think what we need to do is to carefully examine the ways in which social systems are failing and oppressing, and what role we have as human beings in these social systems and in these social systems that need to be corrected. So my third point is that all social actions have unintended consequences and therefore require continued assessment and evaluation. And higher education is very instrumental in addressing assessment and evaluation. Here we might say, well, returning to justice, the justice has very different meanings. We have utilized retributive justice in the form of punishment for centuries. But now I think we need to understand is that we can define justice in other ways, such as procedural and distributive justice. So we are now finding ways that deal with procedural justice that focus on who is involved in the decision-making process and how decisions are made. And these are more important for the rule of law than punishment. At the same time, how we distribute the cost and the benefit of living in a society is more important than who gets punished. And I've done some work in Uganda and Guinea and Kosovo, and these things all come to the forefront. So these innovations can be read in some ways in the UN guidebooks for transformative and restorative justice. So I return again to what's the point of higher education? Why bother? Because I think we are in an incredible time of crisis right now. And crisis reveals what is in our hearts and our social systems. A crisis is a critical moment, a great challenge, but also, and I want to be very clear about this, that it is a great opportunity to make things better. Is it possible, we might ask, to come out of a pandemic better than we went in? And this was a question raised recently by Pope Francis. So to do so, we must ourselves be troubled with others' pain. What is being revealed are the many weaknesses in the social structures. So we are beginning to really see what needs to be changed. You know, for example, here's just one small example. We pay soldiers to learn how to kill, while doctors and nurses and teachers go into debt to receive training, to care for others, and to teach others. So we must ask ourselves, what are we willing to give up to make a better world? I think this is a moment to rethink our priorities, what we want, what we need, and what we seek. When dealing with groups in conflict, Johann Galtung and Christopher Mitchell often brought an extra chair, and it remained empty so people would be conscious of who is missing in the conversation. So we are not isolated individuals, but we are interrelated to others by bonds of reciprocity. And I think we notice this very well in the symbolic nature maybe of wearing a mask. I wear a mask to protect you, you wear a mask to protect me. So this is part of the reciprocity. All parts of society need to be involved in answering these questions. And so higher education can be a part of this, where we can learn to combine all of these different points of view. So we must act, we must practice and continually perfect our actions. And this means checking in with many different people, many different groups, what impact we might have on them. And what are their needs? What do they want? So this is a tremendous time of challenges with the pandemic and all of the other problems that we have. And I just want to say also that this is a tremendous opportunity for change. So in conclusion, and trying to keep very much in mind my time frame here, to answer what is the point of higher education, and I believe higher education can play a very key role here and a very necessary role. So number one, we are fallible. We are bound to make mistakes. Number two, we have human basic responsibilities to each other. And number three, all social actions have unintended consequences. And number four, I think, is the most ironic, is that great challenges also bring great opportunities for change, because as social systems become weakened and they start to crack, we can see where they are failing and we can make great improvements. So to end this, I just think sometimes we need, what is really needed is that sometimes we need to ask different questions. And so this is where the literature review and the methods that we learn in higher education can be very helpful in that endeavor. And I could go on with examples, but I think my time is up, and I want to be very respectful to everyone else. And I think they will provide the examples for you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry. This is a wonderful speech again. And I think that you nail the exact questions that we have. Is it possible to come out of this pandemic any better? What are we willing to give in order to transform for the better as well? I just have as a matter of for the transdisciplinarity that Dr. Muigwa was also calling for, you may be interested to read a little book written by a French author called Raymond Queneau, and his book was called Exercice de Style. It was an exercise to write the same story 99 times in a different way. And
Yeah.
that little booklet is a bijou, as we would say, is wonderful to read because it was issued in 1947. So you see the context as well, in which it was at the time when we attempted to write history after Second World War, and to understand what would be the true story to tell for the future. And so his little booklet, if you put it in context, is a marvelous example that you may wish to look into. It must have been translated also in English. And apart from that, there is also another project that actually speaks or would be water to your fountain. And that is the project of the Council of Europe, where there has been enormous work around re-examining the texts of history books, especially in conflict zones. And that is an ongoing project that should never stop, because as you say, there are as many perspectives as there are people around the world, and higher education has this power to learn how people can actually deal with perspectives in general and acquire the kind of critical outlooks that they need. I am sure that Dr. Samson Milton, we will get back to this in the debate at the end, but I'm sure that Dr. Samson Milton from the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha will pick up on some of those projects, because conflict resolution and humanitarian studies call for all these dimensions and a radical multidisciplinary approach to things. So I would like to give you the floor, Samtam, and hear what you will contribute to this very important debate. So thank you, Terry. If you can switch off your camera and come back later, and Samtam, the floor is yours, and I will turn off my camera as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Van Land and Professor Beitzel. I'm Samson Milton, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies in Doha. And in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about the major findings from my recent paper on higher education and Sustainable Development Goal 16 in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. The paper was recently published in a special issue of the journal Higher Education on the topic of Sustainable Development Goals and higher education. And it's freely available, open access, online for anybody to read. And so the paper really analyzes how higher education in conflict zones can contribute towards SDG16, identifies some major challenges, and suggests some potential opportunities. The research is part of my long-standing research interest on higher education in conflict, which has considered lots of issues, including the impact of conflict on universities, how best to protect higher education from attack, and the roles that higher education can play in conflict prevention, post-conflict reconstruction, and long-term peace building and reconciliation. Now, in the paper, the analysis is really focused on the agency of universities in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, in contributing towards or detracting from SDG 16. I based it on interviews, focus group discussions, and participant observations from a range of countries that are some of the most fragile and conflict affected in the world, including Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, and Sudan. And in the paper, I set out first to categorize how higher education can contribute towards SDG 16. And to do this, I used a model proposed by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network for the Asia Pacific region. And it identifies 4 major areas in which higher education can contribute to the SDGs: education, research, external leadership, and governance and operations. I'll now briefly recap some of the key points on each of these 4 functions. So firstly, teaching is the most direct way in which higher education can contribute, both through specialized programs related to humanitarian action or peace and conflict studies, or increasingly through an interdisciplinary focus on these areas integrated into existing disciplines. And here, my center, the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, shares with Dr. Muiga a commitment to interdisciplinarity. We have people from architecture, engineering, from religious studies and political science, all studying this integrated responses to conflict. And here also, I'd like to acknowledge the excellent tertiary education modules, which are made freely available online under the Education for Justice initiative, which are being used worldwide by universities, including in conflict-affected and fragile contexts. Now, secondly, research is important to achieving SDG 16, and recent years have seen a massive increase in funding from donors globally and research councils addressing the issues of peace, conflict, governance, and related issues. Yet this raises a number of important dilemmas, including the fact that in many fragile states, universities are not the partner of choice when it comes to Northern or Western funded donor-driven research. Often this donor-driven research culture emerges with private consultancies subcontracted to carry out externally directed research rather than investing in the long term in universities in conflict-affected contexts. So whilst there's a lot of challenges to research partnerships in conflict zones, logistical, access issues, political issues, involving higher education in a meaningful way offers really the best model for long-term sustainable capacity enhancement and to ensure the ownership of knowledge in conflict-affected societies. And thirdly, external leadership is also vital to universities in engaging with policy processes on SDG 16. And universities really have a natural partner for cross-sectoral implementation of the SDGs, in particular SDG 16, as part of whole of society approaches. And here I refer back to the interdisciplinarity and working across silos and solving collective and complex problems, which higher education really has a comparative advantage in. And finally, good university governance and operations is also important for fostering participation, demonstrating a commitment to inclusion and justice. This can be achieved through steps such as disassociating universities from funders or organizations that support crime or terrorism by ensuring campus safety, or through modeling the values of inclusion through meaningful participation in open university governance. Now, those are the 4 functional areas in which higher education can contribute towards SDG 16. And now I'll briefly outline some of what I found to be the major challenges facing universities in fragile and conflict-affected contexts in contributing towards SDG 16. And firstly, resource shortages are common in higher education institutions globally, yet they're often more severe in conflict-affected contexts, where universities face the additional challenges of including educational spending being diverted to the security sector, or the need to rebuild damaged or destroyed university campuses. Allocating significant or substantial resources to specialized programs and interventions aimed at contributing towards SDG 16 is also often met with resistance by people who see this as detracting from the more important task of providing the basics of university access and quality. Another challenge is that higher education, in particular in conflict zones in the Middle East and the Islamic world, is increasingly framed as a security threat and consequently becomes a target for interventions aimed at de-radicalization or countering violent extremism. Now, this really raises a dilemma, as on the one hand, there are legitimate security concerns related to campus-based radicalization. Yet on the other hand, there's a risk that the steps taken to counter this threat become heavy-handed and can restrict the positive role universities can play. The most critical challenge, however, is that engaging on many SDG 16 related topics can be politically sensitive and can actually risk increasing the number of attacks on higher education, in particular in violence-ridden environments where the rule of law may be weak. Academics in Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, Yemen, and Libya all reported the limitations of violent reprisals and non-violent harassment resulting from researching or publicly engaging on issues of governance, the rule of law, and in particular, sensitive subjects such as corruption or crime. As a result, in some contexts, SDG 16 related research may be completely off limits, while in others, researchers self-censor or engage in technical, depoliticized research on issues related to SDG 16. And finally, say higher education in conflict zones faces a challenge of navigating the global and the local in addressing SDG 16. The SDGs are conceived as universal goals with targets and indicators that can be refined towards local contexts. Higher education can play a substantive role in localizing SDG 16 by providing context-specific SDG targets and indicators and offering advanced statistical training to enhance SDG monitoring capacity. Now, this is a particular issue for SDG 16 because national statistical capacities are in many places better equipped to gather and analyze data on other SDGs compared to the more contested, conceptually contested issues of peace and governance, which are very difficult to measure. Now, a more meaningful way in which universities can contribute through navigating the local and the global is through questioning the predominant models of peace building and state building. The liberal peace building critique has done much to reveal how local capacities are often sidelined and undervalued in post-conflict societies. Investing in higher education in conflict-affected societies is crucial to ensuring local ownership of knowledge and creating spaces in which to envision alternative pathways to peace and justice at the local level. Now, throughout this study and in years of carrying out similar research, I've been struck by how, despite the immense challenges of conflict and fragility, higher education often remains committed to making a difference in building a more peaceful, just, and inclusive society in line with SDG 16. So one major conclusion or finding of this work is that it adds to the growing body of work challenging the common assumption that any higher education is impossible in conflict zones, let alone specialist contributions to SDG 16. And finally, I'd say, whilst I've focused on many challenges here and less on the opportunities, as we move into the discussion and talk about different strategies, resources, and policies for ensuring that universities can contribute towards SDG 16, I hope that the discussion strikes a more positive note and I can give concrete examples of where I see ways forward.
Excellent, Sansom. Very good presentation on very important topics, and I see that you actually pick up on important points made by your predecessors, and in particular also the very point made by Dr. Muigwa on meaningful education. And this is also a point that was made by Terry. Why higher education? What is the point of it, and why matter? for all the very reasons that you just described, especially in conflict zones. There's still too many wars around the world, and the post-war situation in which many higher education institutions, and for that matter, the higher education leaders, the higher education staff, the students are finding themselves are very difficult, and they need all the support that you're providing, and you will have the opportunity to indeed come back to a few examples in a minute. Without further ado, I would like to go to our fourth set of speakers. We have two speakers who agreed to share a bit of time, but I will give the floor to you, Bianca Kopp, as Global Coordinator of the Higher Education component of the Education for Justice E4J initiative at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. We have had the pleasure of working together quite some time now, and I still remember vividly the day that you contacted us, and that we ourselves, even at the IAU, asked ourselves, is an organization like the IAU able to contribute in any meaningful way to the very battle is not a nice word, but the enormous project that you have and that you're heading, especially on the higher education side. And I am still so very pleased that you knocked on our door and that we opened both doors to cooperation and partnership, because I see after 2 years how much we have been able to accomplish and how the E4J is resonating around the world, thanks to all the good work that you're doing. So let me stop there for now and give you the floor on these important topics where you combine them. SDGs 16, 4, and 17 already on the screen. So the floor is yours, and we will get back to discussing at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilke. Thank you for these nice introductory remarks. And I can just say thank you. Thank you for responding with a yes when we invited you to work with us. And thank you to the thousands of academics that have also started working with us and that inspired us. My short presentation will focus on how we can support, how we from the UNODC, from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, actually want to support higher education institutions in teaching more on SDG related topics, and also sharing with you a little bit of the experience we have had thus far working with thousands of academics and hundreds of higher education institutions worldwide. But before I will start my short presentation, also allow me to say something on the guiding question of the session. Are we ready to educate the future leaders? And I would agree with Dr. Muyoya, yes, we are, but what is the but? We are ready, but we need to strengthen partnerships. We need to strengthen partnerships, and we need to really leave the silo approaches behind us, because it's our world. And we need to jointly work on that to empower the next generation of decision makers, the next generation of leaders, your students. Before I talk a little bit about the Education for Justice initiative, let me just quickly give you a snapshot on what the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is doing. This is important because I would like the participants in this session here to understand why we from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, why we consider the Education for Justice such an innovative initiative and so timely and so helpful to reach Sustainable Development Goals. In a nutshell, and you see it in front of you, our mission statement is to help our member states to make the world safer from drugs, crime and terrorism. How are we doing that? Our traditional approach has been to work very closely with our member states to help them strengthening national capacity. We work with judges, we work with prosecutors, with law enforcement. But until very recently, we have not worked with other stakeholders. We have not worked with academia. And this is what we changed. So what is the SDG that is guiding us? Of course, as you have already seen, it's SDG16 on peace, justice and strong institution. And we changed our approach. And the reason for that was that the member states empowered us to do so. Back in 2015, the member states realized that if we want to strengthen rule of law around the world, if we want to strengthen crime prevention, anti-corruption measures, then we need to apply a more comprehensive approach. And it was back in 2015, even before the 2030 agenda was adopted, that the member states gathered in Doha, Qatar, and adopted the Doha Declaration, a political declaration adopted by all member states, and the first political declaration highlighting the important role of education and educators in strengthening the rule of law and crime prevention worldwide. And this political declaration could have stayed a nice paper if it wouldn't have been for the state of Qatar, who decided we need to fund this. We need to translate the nice words of the member states into action. And it was the state of Qatar that approached us, provided funding to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime to see, please work and materialize. Find out the best ways how we can work together with educators to strengthen rule of law and crime prevention worldwide. So this was basically the start of our Education for Justice initiative. And this came timely. And this new approach, this more comprehensive approach, to not only work with our traditional stakeholders, law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, but to broaden up to include more stakeholders. The importance of this approach was reiterated, was highlighted again by the Secretary General of the United Nations earlier this year, when he called for the decade of action. Our SG was very clear. We are falling behind in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. We are falling behind, and we will not reach them by 2030 if we not start doing things differently, if we not start including all sectors of society and in coming up with new innovative solutions to address old but also new problems. And what was highlighted by him and by other member states was the crucial role of SDG 4 on quality education and SDG16 as being basically the framework. Without them, all the other sustainable development goals cannot be achieved. And also, many member states highlight every year when they assess the status quo of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, the important role higher education has. And I couldn't agree more with Dr. Milton, who basically said, and I have to read that now because my brain is not always the best when I do presentations. He said that teaching is the most direct way of contributing to the SDGs. And yes, it is. So the Education for Justice initiative basically is completely acknowledging that we at UNODC, we are not experts in education, nor are we educators ourselves. And this is why we work with educators, with the experts, to empower them and to support them in teaching the next generation. Because what we often forget when we come up with new policies, we often forget that it's the world of tomorrow, the problems of tomorrow that we need to address. And it would be not fair if we not include the next generation in this. And this is why we have to work with youth around the world, from the primary to the secondary to the tertiary level. So this is in a nutshell what the Education for Justice is about, empowering educators at the primary, secondary, and also at the tertiary level. At the tertiary level, what is at the core of our initiative, and here you have said it, it's partnerships. We need to know who is doing what, how can we contribute. None of us has the means to constantly reinvent the wheels. Let's see what is done around the world, and I think IAU is doing that with its cluster approach and work together. And it's really about building bridges for holistic approaches that help us to strengthen rule of law and to address tomorrow's problem related to SDG16. And what the Education for Justice initiative has tried to do is a very inclusive approach. One pillar, the first pillar, is basically we've asked what can we do to increase the teaching on SDG16 related topics at higher education institutions around the world. And we had a long discussion with hundreds of academics, and what came up was basically that we, together with academics from several hundred countries, developed jointly teaching material for academics that want to teach more on SDG 16 related topics. peer-reviewed teaching material, and it was the biggest endeavor of the United Nations to conduct such a lengthy and huge peer review process. But we didn't stop there. No, we went one step further, also because of the feedback that we received from the academics that we worked with. We continued connecting lecturers around the world to strengthen their networks, to provide a platform for academics to share their knowledge, but also their experience. How is it to teach on corruption in Nigeria? How is it to teach on corruption in Central Asia? And this then led also to our youngest pillar, the third pillar that is focusing on strengthening academia's voice. We have realized that all of us like to work in silos. So we have started organizing academic conferences together with our partners, where we bring together the academics, but also the policymakers and other experts, so that they can really have a setting where they can discuss new ideas and where they can discuss new partnerships. And then we have realized at these conferences, and this was also a very new approach, we also realized when we were at these conferences that actually many of the young voices are missing. So we came up with a young scholar program to bring young scholars from developing countries, but also from other countries, to these important conferences, to empower them to also share their research, because we cannot constantly talk about, let's say, the future of higher education and then not include the young generation of scholars. And finally, we just recently launched a grants program for higher education institutions, for universities interested in becoming a hub for SDG16 teaching. I will not talk a lot about, and I thank Dr. Milton for having referred to our university models. As he said, we have, together with academics, developed those peer-reviewed university models on different areas, from ethics and integrity to crime prevention, criminal justice, organized crime. Everything is available on our website. More importantly is, as I said, we are bringing together academics. We are bringing together academics and other stakeholders to really talk and discuss what we can do to advance the SDG16 together, and how we can make teaching on those important subjects more innovative. We also come up constantly with new tools, particularly during the lockdown. We were approached by many academics saying we need new tools that we can share with our students. So we started also approaching the academics, contributing to our university models, giving interviews on topics from illegal wildlife trade to femicide. And finally, a picture how it looks in practice when we say we want to bridge the gaps. We want to build bridges, and we want us all to leave our silos. These are the pictures to how we bring together the different stakeholders. And allow me now to introduce the next speaker. Allow me now to introduce the next speaker, who is from Qatar, Dr. Fatma Al-Matid. She's an education specialist from the Ministry of Education. And she's here today to talk also about something that I have not mentioned in my presentation, about the importance of skills and values. As I said, we're working with hundreds, actually with thousands of academics worldwide, and it's always very enriching to see the different perspectives that all of us can bring to the table. And thank you also, Dr. Beitzel, for having mentioned how important it is to think about the different truths. So thank you so much. Dr. Al-Matid, you have the floor, please.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you for all my colleagues, but especially thank you, Bianca, for sharing your time slot with me. Now, the SDGs, we all know that the SDGs need to be translated, as you've all explained, into sensible strategies and initiatives through collaborations with higher education institutes and academics. And during this year, both private education, public education, as well as higher education, plunged into the change imposed by COVID, and we all faced a real diagnostic test of our skills and values. All the work that my colleague has presented, it's all highly appreciated out of the university clusters, as you mentioned, in translating SDG16 and SDG4 into real initiative in their respective contexts. Which I hope would be bridging the gap between academics and policymakers towards steering the discussion to empower future leaders. Now, the way I see it, within SDG 4 and 16, two themes need to be central in the discussion, and that is skills and ethics or values. Now, these two themes are important triggers of justice in education. Now, when we talk about higher education, one cannot discard the fact that out of the 200 million unemployed globally, 40% are youth, and a large number of these are college graduates. So there is certainly has to be room for employability skills. What kind of skills students need to face this ever-changing world and the interruption of education? What comes to mind is cognitive skills, but as well emotional skills. We can all see how most of us had to relearn our skills. In Qatar, the whole education system, in the private sector, the public sector, and the higher education was reimagined, establishing a blended education model that is bubble-based, which might have been the case for many countries, to ensure safety of the students. So there are responding skills, creative skills that were not necessarily taught in education or in higher education. Now, moreover, research also indicates that 65% of children attending school today will be working in jobs that do not exist yet. And this is a great challenge. And another challenge is that there is a very weak correlation between higher education and job performance. The research indicates that there is a gap between what students are studying in higher education institutes and what is required from them in the job market. So obviously there is a need for a paradigm shift towards teaching critical soft skills, and soft skills such as emotional intelligence, resilience, integrity, empathy, learnability, as well as leadership skills. And I can come up with many examples where all of these were contextualized through during the pandemic. So to sum up what we need in the skills area is that labor demands are transforming from savoir-faire to savoir-être. Now, the other fold of my general presentation is the importance of ethics and values. So today, more than ever, we face increasing number of development and global changes that are transforming the scope and the conception of education. It doesn't look like what it used to look like, either in the private, public, or the higher education. In an increasingly interdependent world, higher education especially have to deal with the concept of justice.
Go a bit over time slightly, so you don't have to cut it off at 3:30 if you could.
Yes, integrity and the rule of law. So the issue of ethics is integral to the discussion, and the questions that we can ask ourselves are: how do students deal with open education? How do they deal with resources? How do they deal with questions such as plagiarism and the balance between harm and gain? So just to sum up, to what extent are higher education institutions and educational institutions in general are capable of carrying out such policies if in place? I understand that there are various softwares to prevent things like plagiarism, but what about students' innate values, their sense of right and wrong? So ethics of education are important in building peaceful and just societies. This is all from me today. Thank you. Back to you, Bianca.
Thank you very much for this this very nice duo and complementing very nicely the dynamics that are so much necessary to actually transform and ensure some law reinforcement through value-based higher education. And indeed, this transition from savoir-faire to savoir-être, which is absolutely essential if we want to make sure that the students that go through higher education, at whichever age for that matter, because lifelong learning is taking a lot of traction today. So it's not only those aged until 25, but many others, how to equip them with the critical and soft skills that will allow them to move into society fully aware of what is required of them and to engage with societies at best. So thank you for those very important points. And maybe I could start and open the debate period that we have ahead of us. I think we have some 20 minutes. We can go 5 minutes over time. And thank you for that extra opportunity there, because I will give 1 to 2 minutes to each to respond to a set of questions. But I will start with you from this end of the conversation, where there are all these elements that have been put on the table, and the development of such very good tools and opportunities, how to empower lecturers, how to connect the lecturers, and how to develop new partnerships to strengthen the academic voice as well. I would like to refer between this and another project that also is related to this one. We have the opportunity to discuss very quickly, and that's in the context of the Council of Europe, for instance. There was the development of a framework for democratic culture, coming as well with a lot of support for teachers, for educators, to actually embed new kinds of teaching material in their classes. And there we will go back to the other 3 speakers as well. How do you see people pick that up? Because there is an enormous amount of work that is being done. We also know that academic freedom, university autonomy, and the independence of the professors themselves as how they teach, what they teach, and etc. Are very important. So how do you actually bring that to them without sounding too patronizing in a sense and imposing anything, yet maybe developing these new dynamics in a proactive? That's an important part of our partnership as well. And I will get back to you first, Bianca, if you would allow, and maybe that Dr. Fatma as well would like to add something here.
Thank you, Hilja. A very good question. And I have to be honest with you, that was our biggest fears. How would the academics take it if we are telling them we have developed a material for you? And the solution was because we have not developed this material. It was leading academics from around the world. And I got a few white hair, I would say, in the last 2 years when we conducted the peer review process. Both sides learned a lot. The academics learned a lot. We as the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime learned a lot. And then we were wondering, so now we have developed so many resources, have actually put a lot of money in these resources. How would the academics take it? And I have to say it's a success, and we didn't expect it to be such a success. To share numbers with you, we have on an average month, we have more than 800,000 page visits to our website. We have between 2,000 and 3,000 individual users per day that look at our models, and the community of what we call the Education for Justice champions, which are academics that use some of our models for their own teaching, is growing. We have been really addressing a need with a gap with that, and I think it was because of the inclusive process, and because we are already telling them, listen, what E4J together with thousands of academics has prepared is not ready-made. You need to tailor it. You can take some of the models that we have developed, but you need to adapt to it. You need to localize it, because it makes, of course, a difference if you have a class on cybercrime in front of 30 students or in front of 500 students. But We have also been asked to come up also with teaching guides, because let's be very clear, and I talk from Austria, I'm an Austrian, or I used to be an Austrian academic. You know, in Austria, you finish your studies and then you start teaching without ever having received the training. And the situation is the same for many young scholars, young academics around the world. So the feedback that we got is they are embracing the material, but not only the junior ones that might need the content, also the more senior lecturers. Because again, let's face it, the burden, the administrative burden of professors, of educators is basically increasing. And sometimes they don't even have the time to come up with new and innovative exercises. And all of this has been included. But I think without having had this inclusive approach, having academics from all regions and constantly inviting academics to contribute to our models, show us and share with us important research, to also ensure that we have research from underrepresented countries, because often it's not, you know, the research from several African countries, it is not visible. So by approaching them, we're managing to get this and to include that. So it's really, I think, this can only work if it's an inclusive approach. And this is why I said at the beginning, you know, yes, we are ready, but we need to partner.
Wonderful. And it's a bit of a similar question to you, Dr. Mahdi, because the value-based higher education and ethics is something that the IAU is working on a lot. And at the same time, even if the universities from around the world are buying into it and even signing onto it when they join the IAU, there is also this resistance to it, something that was also underlined by Sensam and by Terry. It's this dynamics of, yes, we want it, but we also believe that higher education is no longer the place where these values should be educated or taught or brought to the people. It should have been done in previous stages of the education process. So if just 1 minute so that we give the floor back to the others, could you elaborate on that very quickly? No, we don't hear you yet.
Hi.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, concerning the skills and values and the question of universities taking on modules of that sort, I think raising awareness is one important step into that. But what I also wanted to add is that when we talk about modules about justice and the rule of law, and you know, topics such as even corruption, it would be very beneficial to include all kinds of disciplines, not just to limit it to policy studies or the colleges of law, but to include other areas such as social studies or business, because once these graduates are in the ground, they will be dealing with that, not just in the law capacity, but within their own disciplines. So this is how I see either skills or values in relation to the rule of law and how it can be integrated into all disciplines.
Thank you. Wonderful. So this is really calling for a different approach to education. I think it was you, Bianca, who said we do like to work in silos. I would challenge that one. I don't like to work in silos. I like to work with all the different constituents, but there's something.
Me neither.
But I think that sometimes we're pushed into silos as well, even by the frameworks in which higher education institutions do operate, because there's little time to do things. And due to also the new efficiency agenda that is pushed onto universities today, there is a shrinking space for other things to be done. Yet, all the speakers on the panel have called for multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, for better approach and linking between. And that actually requires quality time and requires flexibility and flexible pathways between disciplines and between departments. And so maybe I can ask Terry, would you see how that would work and what would be the perspective? Maybe that all the speakers can put on their videos and then we can see you again and we can have a conversation of high quality. So of course we have little time, but we can tip in a few ideas that then can be picked up at a later stage. So Terry, if you would like to take that question.
Yes,
1
I'm
minute.
here. Yes, for some reason my camera is not turning on.
But
I
we
don't
hear
know
you
why.
well. We hear you well.
As long as you can hear me, and I think these were the two first points that I made. I will keep this brief, but I think that some of the most important things with higher education is learning research methods, and that is learning the strengths and limitations of every way. That there are many different ways of knowing, and we can borrow these from all of the different disciplines. But we need to know what are the strengths and the limits of these different methods, because doing interviews on the ground has certain strengths, but certain limits. Doing population studies, we learn certain things, but we can't see other things. So that's one. And number two, I think the importance of literature reviews cannot be overstated, because when we start to look at a project, I am always amazed that people have asked and looked at questions that I didn't even think about asking, and they've already answered them. And so that's a very important thing to see, that there are people and organizations already involved probably in the exact work that you're doing, and they've probably been doing it for 20 years. And so that's where I think, just to get, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel, we can learn from other people. That doesn't mean everything is correct and, you know, that there's nothing new to learn, but just so those two things, research methods and literature reviews, I think are really at the heart of the interdisciplinary promise. You know, that is where we can learn best from each other.
Thank you. Dr. Muigwa, this is water to your mill. No, you're muted.
May I say this? We have no choice but to go interdisciplinary, and completely so. Higher education to me does not mean education that is above society. We must come down and begin to talk to the ordinary people. I saw a question on the chat by Dr. Denya to the effect that formal education looks down on the informal. We must move away from there. And I agree with Terry on that point. I also agree with Milton on that point. We must talk to the people. The ordinary people have a lot of knowledge we can get from them. For example, I am a researcher in conflict management. And when I was dealing with mediation, I went down to villagers, people who cannot speak any foreign language, and they know everything about mediation because they've been doing it. Those communities have been doing it for 100 years. So we then should ask the question, how have you been doing it? And this is not just in conflict management, in something like agricultural practices. If you're looking at food security, you would ask those communities, how have you been doing it? You do not dictate to them. So we must come down from those ivory towers, and we spoke about it yesterday, to engage with the stakeholders. You're teaching people for today and tomorrow. So don't you want to hear what they know? And it may well be they know more than you. So it is a humbling experience, but it's a new approach that we must look at it. We must blend our approach. We must deal with those people. If you're talking about something like, finally, about restorative justice, for instance, the people who have practiced it for the longest time ever, and this Terry did say, is those common people. So ask them, how do you do it? And then you have a better answer than quoting from texts, wherever those texts are coming from. So we really have to change the way we look at it, change the whole paradigm and approach it differently for it to work. Thank you.
Thank you. How would you like to take this on, Sansom? I do not.
I'll begin. I have a quick word to say about the issue of academic freedom and university autonomy. And then I'll connect back to the points about that Dr. Mwiga has just made. And so really, when it comes to the values of academic freedom and university autonomy in conflict-affected countries, I really see that university autonomy and academic freedom are valued for sort of making the university off limits and protecting universities from attack, and also for the flourishing of the knowledge economy and a knowledge society. Yet, through the concept of university autonomy in many post-conflict contexts has been perhaps applied too readily, assuming that the conditions are there for it to really be able to function. I'm thinking here about the universities in Iraq post-2003, where we came in with the interveners hat, the coalition, and recommended getting rid of the Ministry of Higher Education on the idea that university autonomy would flourish, and that the university system would be able to compete in the same way that the US system does without a centralized Ministry of Higher Education. But this really misunderstands the concept of autonomy when taken to be a negative or an absence of the state, misunderstands that the local context in Iraq necessitated that different elites, militias, and local power holders captured the interests of universities, and no autonomy really flourished. You went from one controlling agent to having many controlling agents. As many Iraqis told me, of the Iraqi professors I worked with 10 years ago, when I was researching this case, we went from having one Saddam to 1,000 Saddams. So it doesn't, this also connects to the point about how outside promotion of norms such as democracy and human rights can be received. It makes me think of the example of where we worked in Libya post the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi and the intervention in 2011. I was involved working in York with a project to help with Tripoli University program for rebuilding Libya, which was a university-based program. It had very liberal goals of democratization and civil society development. And ultimately the program was rejected after a 9-month period, which got most of the liberal professors very excited and had promised to do a lot of good work. But essentially, as we've seen in many of the Arab Spring states, there was a backlash or a counter-revolution and people uneasy with the pace of change. Essentially, the program was rejected. And speaking to people afterwards, it seems they said there's a lot of stuff around framing. When you come in and loudly say this is a center for transition, peace and change, they said if you'd have simply done similar work, but framed it differently, this is a center for research and develop something slightly depoliticized, it would have been a more culturally sensitive framing. So whilst I wouldn't necessarily always want to hide the true intentions of a program, I'd say it just needs to be conflict and context sensitive when promoting these types of values. To come back, very quickly, to come back to the point about silos, I had made the same point as Bianca in my notes, that we're too used to working in silos. And this goes both the same for the international system of conflict response, and also as in my hat as a university researcher, the disciplinary system. And just to connect back to something that Dr. Mwiga said, and to connect this to the point of localization and research that we've done recently, which is really when you speak with people on the ground in conflict-affected communities, they don't understand people coming in as either humanitarian or development or peace building. They don't see these sectoral silos, these divisions, these artificial divisions. And the university really is a perfect partner for trying to think beyond these types of boxes that we've created for ourselves.
Okay, thank you. So there is a lot more to discuss here. What I see from actually all the presentation is that you all seem to advocate for co-construction. It is never from one end or the other, but it is always together. And it is actually to each time try and get out of your comfort zone, were it disciplinary comfort zone or national comfort zone or individual comfort zone or any. And so the co-construction is at the heart of all your, I have plenty of pages here, but what would be interesting is to see, we have also a graphic designer who tried to frame in a graphical way, or to resume or resumate or so I'm losing my words here, and I'm reverting to French, but it would be interesting to have a look at how he picked up on the different discussions, also in a graphic way. It's maybe about time. So if you could possibly share.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to share it with you.
And just to explain to the participants, this is what we are trying at the United Nations to do, to really, with using graphic recording, summarize the essence of the discussion that we had, also to make it visible to member states what we have discussed in today's session. And I like what I see now in front of me, Hilke. I think you will agree with me, the bridge in the middle is a good one.
Is a good one. And I would like to ask each of the speakers on this session to take a critical look, because that is the other entry point that everybody has made. We have to have critical thinking and really think about what we do twice rather than once. And if I may ask each of you to say, what is the word that you would see is missing? And if none, please say so. So I will ask Dr. Fatma, can you please identify one word that should be introduced here?
Yeah, I don't think I see the words ethics or skills in if I'm seeing the whole thing. Yeah.
Ah, the picture has disappeared. Is it still somewhere? Do you see it still, Bianca, or not?
No, sorry, it was kicked out.
Sorry, I was thrown out, but the terms ethic and soft skills are included. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Very good.
That's what I thought. Maybe I don't see it.
To share the whole picture afterwards to everyone, but I'm glad if you can contribute with other terms.
Okay, thank you.
That
thank
was
you,
very
Dr.
clever.
Almasi. That's very useful. Then I turn to Terry. Is there a word you would like to include here?
I did not see the I did not see the word. It could have been there, but I think perhaps the word humility should be involved, in the sense that none of us have the full picture or the full honest reality. So we need other people to collaborate with. So I would maybe add humility if that word is not there. But I think it's a wonderful chart.
Thank you. And Dr. Muigwa.
I cannot see the picture, but I hope it has multidisciplinary, the word blended, meaningful education, ICT outreach, all those nice things we have discussed today, and they're relevant. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Bianca, do you see any word that you would have missed, or is it just perfectly fine? You're muted.
After almost 1 year of virtual conferences, this is still happening. I think what we need to include is the next leaders, or the youth that should be there, because we are educating the next leaders. And Hilke, what would be the word that you have been missing there?
I don't think I missed any, because they're all very much represented, as you said in the beginning, by the metaphor of the bridge. Bridging the divides, bridging the knowledge systems, bridging the points of views. And indeed, that is, to cross a bridge, you have to have some humility as well, because you have to go to the other one and get to the other. And the bridge was not a flat one. It was one that was actually coming as with a need to build to climb up the bridge and to meet at the top, because it is the top when we indeed do meet really, and in true sense of the term, i.e. Looking way beyond any stereotype, looking way beyond perception of a reality that would be the one that we believe the other would have, or that we do have. There is much more that we can discuss here. What we will do is literature review of anything that you've all been writing about. We will bring it together. We will certainly also look at the strengths of our limits and the limits of our strengths, and see how in the future we can continue this conversation, because I believe there is a lot of food for thoughts for not only those who took part and watched the session, but as well for me as a moderator. I would like to thank you very much for all that you shared during this presentation, and it is with pleasure that I will watch back on this recorded session. So thank you very much for your time, for your investment, for your wonderful ideas, and for sharing so much of your wisdom. Have a very nice day, evening, or whatever, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. A big thank you also from us, the panelists, to Hilje for having done a marvelous job in moderating this challenging session. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks you, and nice cooperation. So we continue.
Bye-bye. Nice afternoon, nice evening, nice morning to all. Bye-bye.